Hello my friends, my name is Cole, this is Astrid, welcome back to Boas and Buffoonery. Today, I'm going to go over the top 5 best pet reptiles for kids. Now, a quick disclaimer before we get into this video, a pet of any kind should not be the sole responsibility of a child. At the end of the day, this video is mostly for parents whose kids have expressed an interest in keeping pet reptiles and trying to help you decide which one fits into your family's lifestyle. Regardless of what reptile you end up choosing or what pet you end up bringing into your home, a great deal of that animal's care responsibility is going to fall on you as a parent. So it's really important for you as an adult to do the research to make sure that you and your kid together are taking the best care of that animal possible. Another thing that I really want to stress is that reptiles live a long time. A lot of the reptiles on this list are going to live for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, some even longer than that. So it's important to understand that one of two things are going to happen when your kid eventually moves out. One is that kid has built a bond with their animal and they want to continue to take care of it as they move forward in their adult lives. That's awesome, that's exciting, that's what we're all really rooting for. However, the much more common and much more likely scenario is that when your kid moves out to go to college or university or wherever they go beyond your home, is that they will leave that animal behind. And it will then become your responsibility to take care of that animal for the remainder of its life. All that being said, for a kid, keeping a pet reptile can be an incredible, remarkably rewarding experience that I greatly encourage. Allowing and encouraging your child to keep a pet reptile can be an awesome way to teach them some responsibility whilst developing a bond with an animal that they are absolutely going to grow to love. But before we get into the list, let me describe sort of my criteria for what I deem to be a good pet reptile for a child. First and foremost, you want a species that, on the averages, is unlikely or reluctant to bite, musk, scratch. These are all things that can create a negative experience associated with reptiles for a kid that may not affect an adult in the same way. This behavior is largely going to come down to the individual animal, but you can hedge your bets by picking a species that is far less likely to become cantankerous or cause any sort of minor harm to your kid. The next criteria I have is size. You want something that is reasonably small because you want your kid to be able to set them up in an enclosure for them to thrive, likely in their bedroom so that they can watch it constantly. That's why I've limited this list to mostly animals that can live their entire lives comfortably and happy in an enclosure that is 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, which is kind of the most readily available size of enclosure that is dedicated to reptiles specifically. I've also heavily skewed this list towards animals that are generally affordable to purchase and set up well in an enclosure, as well as animals whose maintenance is not particularly difficult. At the end of the day, the goal is for your child to be able to do most of the care and maintenance for this animal, so you don't want it to be too complicated or difficult that they feel overwhelmed or stressed. You want them to look forward to interacting with their animal, to caring for that animal, to enriching the lives of that animal. This list was actually incredibly difficult to narrow down, so I promise this is the last thing before we actually get into it, but I do have a handful of honorable mention species that I almost included in this list, but they missed out for just one reason or another. The first of my honorable mentions is the smallest subspecies of one of my favorite species of snakes on the planet, the carpet pythons. Specifically, the Irian carpet python is an incredible snake that typically grows between 5 and 6 feet in length, is relatively slender, but holds on well due to their strong muscles. They are a beautiful, beautiful snake. They are inquisitive, they are fun to interact with. The issue that kept the Irian carpet python off this list, outside of being maybe a little bit too big for this list, was the fact that, especially as juveniles, they do have a tendency to be a little bit flighty or bitey. This typically mellows out as they become adults, but you're likely going to be getting your kid a baby snake, so that was what held them off this list. The next honorable mention is the gargoyle gecko, and quite honestly, This honorable mention slot could go to any of the New Caledonian arboreal geckos, like the crested gecko. They are phenomenal, and realistically, a kid could take great care of a gargoyle or a crested gecko. The reason why I kept them off this list is because they do require a little more regular maintenance than do some of these other animals. They require constant misting of their enclosure to keep their humidity nice and high. And as babies, they can become so flighty that they actually injure themselves. Oftentimes with crested geckos and gargoyle geckos, when they're babies, they will jump randomly off of just about anything, causing them to potentially hurt themselves. And the most common form of injury for a pet crested gecko or gargoyle gecko is them jumping off of something randomly and unexpectedly, and you go to try to catch them and they drop their tail. And that's something that most kids don't really want to experience. And finally, another honorable mention that I had to include is corn snakes. And quite honestly, you could lump a lot of the North American rat snakes in this list with them. Things like the Texas rat snake or the greenish rat snakes, these all make phenomenal pets, and the right kid could absolutely take good care of a corn snake or any of these other rat snakes. The reason why I left them off this list is because they just grow too big for that 4-foot enclosure. They get to be 5 or 6 feet long. They are active diurnal snakes that are quite intelligent, so I couldn't in good conscience leave them on this list. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the actual top 5, starting with number 5, leopard geckos and African fat-tailed geckos. You knew these were going to be on the list. They're the most popular pet lizard on the planet. They're incredibly docile. They're absolutely adorable. They look like little dragons. They're easy to take care of. The list goes on and on. They are readily available. They are incredibly affordable. And if you set one up in a 4-foot enclosure, you, to most of the hobby, are going above and beyond. You're allowing them to truly thrive. You can set up an excellent temperature gradient, and it's not going to be particularly difficult to do. You can set them up with a smorgasbord of hides and basking areas, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. They are incredibly personable. They're generally very, very friendly. You can hold them, spend time with them, interact with them, and the worst that's going to happen is they might poop on you. Now, the one downside I can see with things like leopard geckos and African fat-tailed geckos is the fact that their diet consists of insects. So you will have to keep insects in your home. That's actually why they're number 5 on this list and not closer to number 1, is sometimes when people are hesitant to get into keeping reptiles or amphibians, they don't want to deal with crickets. And unfortunately, if you're going to be keeping a leopard gecko, you are going to at least have to deal with things like crickets, mealworms, and if you're feeling fancy, roaches. But if you can get past the feeding insects and keeping insects in your house thing, oh my gosh, you are going to have a phenomenal time with your leopard gecko. Obviously, do your research about taking care of them properly, but it's not rocket science. They're pretty straightforward. They kind of make the ultimate pet reptile for someone who doesn't really like reptiles. I know that sounds kind of weird and sounds kind of strange, but if you as a parent are nervous around snakes or nervous around lizards that have claws or that can climb glass, sometimes those movement patterns can be off-putting to people, and the leopard gecko kind of alleviates all of that by very normally walking around on 4 legs. They're tiny, they're cute, they look like they're smiling all the time. They come in a million different colors. I feel like you don't really need to go on. You're familiar with leopard geckos. If you've been in any pet store ever, you've seen leopard geckos. There's a reason they're there. There's a reason for their popularity. They absolutely deserve it. Next up on our list is a reptile that I used to see in pet stores, that I used to see at expos all the time. When I was coming up in the hobby, they were everywhere. You couldn't go to a reptile shop without seeing a Pueblan milk snake. These, I really wanted to put a king snake of some sort on this list. And for those of you that don't know, milk snakes are a subsect of the king snake family. And Pueblan milk snakes are absolutely gorgeous, and they fit all the criteria that I'm looking for. They're a small snake that's going to hold on to you during handling. They're inquisitive, they're curious, they're fun to interact with, they're fun to handle. They don't need a colossal enclosure, and you can set them up really, really well. I don't really know why I stopped seeing them as a popular choice in the hobby. They come from parts of central Mexico, and there's still plenty of people breeding them. They're not prohibitively expensive, and they kind of alleviate the one issue that I had with most of the king snakes that I tried to put on this list is that king snakes on the averages are bitey, especially as babies. A lot of king snakes have a tendency to be a little nippy, especially if you have other pet reptiles, because king snakes are snake eaters. So if you smell like a snake, a lot of king snake species can make the mistake of thinking that you are food and will try to nibble on your fingers. King snakes across the board just eat really well, which is another thing that I wanted to make sure of when I put an animal on this list. I wanted to make sure that the animal that you're getting is one that will eat consistently for you, because that can be just a point of anxiety and nerve for a new keeper, especially a young one. So having a king snake that has that ferocious appetite but is incredibly unlikely to bite is just the best of both worlds. I don't know specifically what it is about Puebloan milk snakes, but I've interacted with tons of them and every single one has been an absolute delight. Not only have I never been bit by a Puebloan milk snake in all my time working with them, but I've never had one strike at me. I've never had one strike at all outside of feeding time. The one downside potentially to a Puebloan milk snake is that they're not particularly active during the day. You're not going to see them move around a whole lot, but with the amount of time you're going to want to spend taking them out of the enclosure and interacting with them, I don't actually see that as that big of a deal. Really, the big thing that you're going to have to get over with the Puebloan milk snake, along with pretty much any other pet snake that you get, is feeding rodents. That's another kind of hang-up that some people have about keeping pet reptiles, is the idea of keeping frozen rodents in their freezer. But with a Puebloan milk snake, you have to keep basically small frozen mice. You can thaw them out in warm water and then dangle them in front of their face, and they're never going to not eat. So you're never wasting a rodent's life, which I think is really important. Honestly, I mostly wanted to include Puebloan milk snakes on this list, not just because I genuinely believe they fit every piece of criteria I set out for this list, but I also just kind of want to know why the discussion ended around these snakes. They were everywhere. They were so prevalent when I was growing up, and I just wish more people still talked about them, because they're still incredible pet snakes. I have to sort of apologize for this next entry, I suppose. I'm pulling a bit of a Wiccan's Wicked Reptiles here and including an amphibian on my top 5 reptile list, but there's good reason for it. The reason I'm including an amphibian on this list is because at the end of the day, sometimes parents are just scared of reptiles. There are just people out there that no matter how adorable or no matter how easy to take care of, there are going to be parents who do not want their kids to have a pet reptile. They might be scared of lizards, they might be scared of snakes, or they just might not like them very much. And as much as I want to work to change the reputation of reptiles and change people's opinions, it usually doesn't start from bringing a snake into your house. Sometimes it does. I've heard great stories, but that's typically not the case. So I wanted to include an animal that if you as a kid are really excited about the idea of keeping a pet reptile or amphibian, and your parents are terrified of reptiles, you could show them a Pac-Man frog. Are you kidding me? Look at this thing. These frogs are awesome. They're maybe my favorite frogs on the planet, though there's a couple that give them a run for their money. They are 1/3 mouth. They're incredible eaters. They come in a million beautiful, beautiful morph variations and colors. On top of that, they're affordable to purchase. They're affordable to set up well in an enclosure, and the enclosure doesn't have to be all that complex, because this animal is going to sit perfectly still for most of its life, especially when you're not feeding it. During the day, they're not really going to do much, but if your kid is in school, I don't see that being a very big deal. They come from parts of South America, so they will need a very humid enclosure, but they like it relatively cool. It's not very difficult to set them up well. And feeding them is some of the most fun you can have. Feeding a pet anything, they are ridiculous. They will lunge out of the dirt after food. They will often topple over themselves just to get a bite of dinner. And you can vary their diet to keep things interesting. They will feed primarily on insect feeders, but as full-grown adults, they can take down things like pinky mice. This is definitely a pro and a con depending on who you are. A varied diet is awesome and interesting and cool, but if you're someone who's kind of uncomfortable with all different types of feeders, it may put you off. But if you're someone who's uncomfortable with all these different types of feeders, I'd kind of recommend you go back and look at the gargoyle geckos that we talked about in the honorable mentions, because, well, they can survive off of mostly paste, which is nice, but it's not quite as interesting as the Pac-Man frog that can devour basically anything that's the same size or slightly smaller as itself. Realistically, the one downside I can see with Pac-Man frogs is they don't really do a whole lot. They kind of just sit there for most of their lives, but their maintenance requirements are very low. So especially if you are a busy family or if your kid is particularly lazy, this could be a pretty excellent pet choice. Now, moving on to number 2 on this list, I am breaking one of my rules. I said at the beginning of this video that all of the animals on this list would be able to thrive in an enclosure that is 4 by 2 by 2 or smaller. But I couldn't let this animal not be on the list, even though it is absolutely too big as an adult to fit in a 4 by 2 by 2 enclosure. This is also by far the most expensive animal on this list, both to buy the animal and to set up the enclosure well. But I think it's worth it. I'm talking about the blue-tongue skinks. And I really don't care what specific species you're interested in. The entire genus of blue-tongue skinks are phenomenal pet reptiles for people of any age. These are terrestrial skinks that come from parts of Australia and Indonesia. They live in humid yet cool-ish environments, so their enclosure isn't particularly difficult to set up. I would recommend a good-sized water bowl to hold that humidity and a substrate that holds humidity well, but outside of that, you fill it with hides and foliage and they're going to do great for you. I still recommend obviously proper heating and lighting and UVB, but this isn't a care guide video. I'm just telling you that you absolutely want a blue-tongue skink. Now, as adults, these lizards can get quite large, so you probably want to eventually move them into a 5 or a 6 foot enclosure, but again, it's well worth the extra investment. These are curious, personable, beautiful lizards that are an absolute blast to handle and interact with, and much like the Pac-Man frog, they enjoy a varied diet. Unlike the Pac-Man frog, it's not just dead rodents and bugs. A bulk of a blue-tongue skink's diet are going to come from vegetables, fruits, and even some limited ground meat that you can buy at the grocery store. It makes them actually very easy to feed compared to a lot of the other reptiles on this list if you are someone who is uncomfortable with live or frozen feeders. I've even heard of people having great success feeding their blue-tongue skinks predominantly like wet dog food, and they do just great. I don't know if I would make this the staple of their diet or the only thing that you feed them, but it is something you can use to sort of supplement their food. Really, one of the coolest things about the blue-tongue skink is that you have this big, impressive-looking lizard that is incredibly slow-moving, is incredibly predictable, and even though they do have claws that are sharper than any of the other animals on this list, they don't really scratch. They will use their claws to sort of hold on to tree bark and stuff as they climb over it, but they don't really dig in, so it's unlikely you're going to get injured by a blue-tongue skink. You may get a little scratch, but it's really not that big of a deal. I really think that for most people, especially people who maybe were looking into getting a bearded dragon, or were looking into getting something like a Euromastix, like my boy Magnus, I think a blue-tongue skink probably makes more sense for more people than those other popular mid-size lizard options. Not because I think there's anything wrong with bearded dragons or Euromastix, it's just that their care tends to be a lot more involved than people will give them credit for. And a blue-tongue skink is a little bit more unique and, in my opinion, probably easier for most people to take good care of. All right, now we're moving on to number 1 on this list. And quite honestly, it's the animal that sparked my interest to create this list in the first place. Over this past summer, I got the chance to work at a reptile day camp through Scales Nature Park. It was an absolute blast. And there was one kid in particular who was just incredibly invested in reptiles. She absolutely loved snakes, and she really wanted a pet snake, and her parents were on board, but they wanted help kind of figuring out what the best pet reptile for her was going to be. After chatting with this kid for a little while, a light bulb just went off and we figured out the perfect pet snake for her, and what I believe to be the best pet snake and maybe the best pet reptile for any kid ever. And that is North America's own Rosy boa. Now, it's no secret, I love boas of all kinds. I love little rosy boas, I love boa constrictors like my girl Urza, and really my dream snake one day down the line, if I win the lottery, is to own an anaconda. So I may be a little bit biased, but when I say that rosy boas make the best pet snakes for kids, and honestly for most people, I really mean it. These are small terrestrial boas, so you can set them up really well in a reasonably sized enclosure. They are bred commonly in captivity. They are not at risk in the wild, so you can get one without any sort of ethical dilemma. They are incredibly adorable. I mean, look at that face. Are you kidding me? They come in these beautiful colors, these pinks, these browns, these reds, and all wrapped up in a boa package. Boas that eat like boas, but live in North America, so you don't have to worry about crazy high humidity. You don't have to worry about crazy high temperatures. You can set up a rosy boa in an enclosure that is relatively similar to something that you would set up a corn snake in. Though corn snakes come from the East Coast and rosy boas from the West Coast. But really, for me, they check all the boxes for the perfect pet reptile for a kid. They are slow moving and methodical, so they are not going to be so flighty that a kid's going to have trouble handling them. They are also going to be fun enough to handle that a kid's not going to get bored because they are curious, they will explore, and when you take them out of the enclosure, they will be flicking their tongue around trying to see what's going on around them. They are not prohibitively expensive either to buy or to set up really well, and they are incredibly reluctant to bite. At least in my experience, I have never met a rosy boa that had any kind of attitude. Now, like most other reptiles, they do live a long time, so you still may run into the issue of a pet that is left in your home after your kid moves away to college or wherever they go next. However, because their setup is pretty reasonable, there is a non-zero chance they may be able to set that animal up in their dorm. Take them with them. Really, I love rosy boas. I think they're fantastic. And honestly, if I ever have kids of my own, I would happily get them a pet rosy boa, provided I don't already have one and they're interested in reptiles. But guys, those are my top 5 pet reptiles for kids. At the end of the day, I really do want to stress that no pet of any kind should be the sole responsibility of a child. But if you have a kid who is really, really excited about reptiles or really, really excited about creepy crawlies in general, I hope this list has helped you to sort of narrow down what the best options are for your situation and for your kid. If you enjoyed this content and you see the value in it, feel free to leave me a like, subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. Leave a comment if you think there's an animal that I missed on this list. If you think there's an animal that absolutely should have been here but wasn't for some reason. And let me know if you really disagree with one of the animals that I put on the list. I'm excited to hear your perspective. With all that being said, guys, have a wonderful rest of your day. Have an awesome rest of your week, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers. Now, a couple weeks ago, now a couple months ago,